Chapter 1. The Servant in the Stables. "You're too weak-blooded for even this work, girl. The beasts can smell your worthlessness from across the compound." The words hit like stones thrown at glass, each one finding its mark with practised cruelty. Lyra felt them settle into the familiar hollow space beneath her ribs where all such truths lived, adding their weight to the collection she had been carrying for 19 years. Head trainer Magnus stood in the doorway of the war beast stables, his massive frame blocking out the morning light as he watched her scrub dried blood from the stone floors. She had learned long ago not to flinch, not to look up, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing how his words landed. Instead, she kept her focus on the crimson stains that told the story of yesterday's training session, when the newest batch of noble-born contestants had tried and failed to earn the respect of creatures that had been killing men for centuries. The war beast stables stretched before her like a cathedral of stone and shadow, each massive enclosure housing a creature of legend. Some paced behind their reinforced barriers with restless energy. Others lay sleeping, their breathing deep and rumbling enough to vibrate through the floor beneath her knees. All of them were worth more than her life, and everyone made sure she knew it. "The bonding trials begin in 3 days, Magnus continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from being the only man in the kingdom who could command respect from both nobles and monsters. "Lord Aldrich's son will be attempting the Ironback Wyvern, Lady Morgana has her eye on the Frost Wolves, and our precious Alpha King himself will finally choose his destined companion." He paused, and she could feel his gaze like ice against her bent neck. "What do you think you'll be doing during the trials, servant girl?" Lyra dipped her brush back into the bucket of soapy water, watching the pink swirl of diluted blood spiral through the suds. "Cleaning up after them, sir." "That's right, because that's all you're good for. That's all you've ever been good for." His boots echoed against the stone as he walked deeper into the stables, making his morning inspection. 20 years I've been training warriors to bond with war beasts, and not once have I seen someone as pathetically unsuited to this work as you. The creatures won't even look at you properly. It's like you don't exist." If only he knew how right he was, how sometimes she felt like a ghost haunting her own life, invisible to everyone except when they needed someone to blame or abuse. She had been working in these stables since she was old enough to hold a bucket, brought here as a foundling with no name and no past, and in all that time she had never once felt like she belonged anywhere. But Magnus was wrong about one thing. The war beasts did look at her. They looked at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl and her heart race for reasons she couldn't understand. They watched her move through their domain with eyes that seemed to see too much, recognize something she didn't even know existed. Sometimes she caught them tilting their heads as if listening to a sound only they could hear, and always, always, their attention followed her like a weight she couldn't shake. She finished scrubbing the last of the blood from the floor and moved to the next enclosure, where a pair of shadow lynx dozed in the artificial twilight they preferred. These creatures were beautiful in the way that deadly things often were, their smoke-coloured fur rippling with muscle beneath skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They were bonded to twin warriors from the eastern provinces, brothers who had won their loyalty through a combination of skill and sheer stubborn determination. As Lyra began cleaning their water trough, both cats opened eyes like molten silver and fixed their stare on her. She tried to ignore them, but their attention was like a physical touch, raising goosebumps along her arms and making the hair at the nape of her neck stand on end. "Even the bonded ones act strange around you," Magnus said from behind her, and she realized he had been watching the interaction. "It's unnatural. Beasts that have chosen their warriors shouldn't pay attention to random servants, but they all do it with you. Makes me wonder what kind of cursed blood runs in your veins." Cursed blood. She had heard that phrase attached to her name more times than she could count, always spoken like an explanation for why she didn't fit, why she made people uncomfortable without even trying. She had no family history to point to, no bloodline to claim or deny. She was nothing and no one, a blank slate that people filled with their own fears and prejudices. The morning routine continued with mechanical precision. Feed the bonded beasts their carefully prepared meals of fresh meat and magical supplements. Check the integrity of the barrier spells that kept the more dangerous creatures contained. Replace the bedding in the enclosures of those beasts still seeking their destined partners. And through it all, she felt eyes on her from every direction, watching, evaluating, waiting for something she couldn't name. The work was hard and thankless, but it was honest in a way that most things in her life were not. The beasts didn't care about her social status or her mysterious parentage. They simply existed in their primal magnificence, powerful and beautiful and utterly themselves. Sometimes she envied them that certainty, that unshakable knowledge of what they were meant to be. She was replacing straw in one of the middle enclosures when she heard it. A sound like distant thunder, low and rumbling, and somehow felt more than heard. It came from the far end of the stables, from the section she was never allowed to enter alone, the section that housed the shadow mane. Every person in the kingdom knew the legend of the ancient war beast. It had been captured 2 centuries ago by the greatest warrior king in their history, a man whose bloodline had ruled for generations until it died out in plague and war. The Shadowmane was the size of a small building, with fur black as midnight and eyes like dying stars. It had refused every warrior who had approached it since its original master's death, and its rejection was violent enough to require healing magic for the survivors. But it was still brought out for every generation's bonding trials, because prophecy said that one day the right bloodline would return, and the Shadowmane would know its true master by scent alone. Until then, it waited in its reinforced prison, too valuable to kill and too dangerous to ignore. The rumbling sound came again, and this time Lyra felt it in her bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside her chest, like a tuning fork struck against her ribs. She found herself dropping the armload of fresh straw and walking toward the sound before conscious thought caught up with instinct. "Where do you think you're going?" Magnus's voice cracked like a whip behind her. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "I thought I heard something." "You thought wrong. The Shadowmane section is off-limits to servants. You know that." His footsteps approached, and she could feel his displeasure radiating outward like heat from a forge. "That beast has killed 12 men in the last 50 years, and those were trained warriors with full magical protections. What do you think it would do to a weak little nothing like you?" Probably tear her apart without a second thought. She knew that. But the sound called to her anyway, like a voice speaking her name in a language she almost remembered. She turned back to her work, but the feeling lingered, a restless energy that made her want to pace the confines of her small world like the caged creatures she tended. The day passed with agonizing slowness. More cleaning, more feeding, more careful maintenance of the complex systems that kept dozens of supernatural predators contained and healthy. Magnus found fault with everything she did, his criticism sharper than usual as the stress of the upcoming trials put everyone on edge. The bonding trials only happened once every 5 years, and this one carried special significance because Alpha King Kyle would finally choose his destined war beast companion. Everyone knew the political implications. The Alpha King's marriage to Lady Seraphina had been arranged since birth, a union designed to strengthen the bonds between the northern and eastern territories. But tradition demanded that he bond with a war beast before taking a mate, proving his worthiness to rule through supernatural recognition. If no beast chose him, or if he failed to master his chosen companion, his claim to the throne would be questioned by rival factions who had been waiting decades for such an opportunity. Lyra had seen Lady Seraphina once, from a distance, during a formal visit to the palace. She was everything a queen should be, beautiful, elegant, confident in her own power. Her golden hair caught light like spun metal, and her laugh carried across courtyards with the musical quality of wind chimes. She was planning to attempt bonding with one of the celestial hawks during the trials, magnificent creatures whose loyalty would complement her husband's eventual choice perfectly. The contrast between Seraphina's destined glory and Lyra's invisible servitude was so vast it might as well have existed in different worlds. And yet, as the afternoon wore on and the strange restlessness continued building in her chest, Lyra found herself wondering what it would feel like to walk into that arena not as a servant clearing tables, but as someone with a right to be there. The thought was ridiculous enough to make her laugh, a bitter sound that startled the nearest war beast into alertness. She was nobody. She had always been nobody. The bonding trials were for people with bloodlines and birthrights and the kind of inner fire that could call to creatures of legend. She was just the girl who cleaned up their mess afterward. But as the sun began to set and she finished the last of her duties, that rumbling sound came again from the Shadowmane's section, longer this time, more insistent, and accompanied by the sound of something massive moving against stone barriers. Magnus had left for the evening, taking his constant criticism with him, and the stables felt different in his absence. Quieter, but also more alive somehow, as if the beasts could relax when he wasn't there to remind them of their captivity. Lyra stood in the main corridor, looking toward the forbidden section, feeling that strange pull in her chest, growing stronger with each passing moment. She shouldn't go. She knew she shouldn't go. But her feet were already carrying her forward, drawn by something that felt older and more fundamental than conscious choice. The Shadowmane's enclosure was a masterwork of magical engineering. Stone walls thick as castle fortifications, reinforced with barrier spells that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Iron bars as thick as her wrist, engraved with runes of binding and containment. And behind all those protections, something massive moved in the shadows. Its presence felt like a storm front approaching across empty plains. Lyra approached the barrier with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never been this close to the legendary creature, had only heard descriptions of its terrible majesty from warriors brave enough or foolish enough to attempt bonding over the years. She pressed her face against the cold iron bars and peered into the darkness beyond. Two eyes opened in the shadows, eyes like dying stars, ancient and knowing, and filled with an intelligence that made her breath catch in her throat. The Shadowmane was even larger than the stories claimed, its shoulders higher than her head, even while it lay resting. Its fur absorbed light like smoke, making it seem more like a living shadow than a physical creature. But it wasn't moving to attack. It wasn't even moving at all. It was simply watching her with those impossible eyes, and she was watching it back, and between them something passed that felt like recognition. Not the instant overwhelming connection she had heard described in bonding stories, but something quieter and more profound, like looking into a mirror and seeing yourself clearly for the first time. "I know you," she whispered, and didn't understand why the words felt true. The Shadowmane tilted its massive head, and she could have sworn she saw something like surprise flicker across its ancient features. Then it rose to its feet in one fluid motion, moving with the kind of grace that only came from absolute confidence in one's own power. It approached the barrier separating them, and Lyra should have run. Every survival instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run. Instead, she reached through the bars. The moment her fingertips touched the creature's muzzle, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded her mind. Ancient forests under starlight, the sound of hunting horns echoing across vast distances, the feeling of running faster than wind, with power flowing through muscles that could tear apart mountains. And underneath it all, a voice that seemed to come from inside her own bones. "Princess." She jerked her hand back, gasping, and the connection severed like a snapped rope. The Shadowmane stepped back as well. its star-bright eyes wide with something that looked remarkably like shock. They stared at each other across the barrier, both of them breathing hard, both of them trying to process what had just happened. Footsteps echoed from the main corridor, and Lyra spun around to see Magnus returning with his evening lantern. Panic shot through her system as she realized how much trouble she was in, how impossible it would be to explain what she was doing in the forbidden section. She ran, her heart pounding loud enough to drown out the sound of her own footsteps, and didn't stop until she reached the servants' quarters on the far side of the compound. But even safe in her small room with the door barred behind her, she could still feel those ancient eyes watching her, could still hear that impossible word echoing in her mind like a promise or a threat: Princess. Tomorrow the bonding trials would begin, and the kingdom would witness the Alpha King choose his destined companion. Lady Seraphina would attempt her own bonding, solidifying her position as the perfect mate for the perfect ruler, and Lyra would serve refreshments to the noble spectators while pretending she belonged in their world about as much as a candle flame belonged in a hurricane. But tonight, in the darkness of her tiny room, she touched her fingertips to her lips and wondered what it would feel like to be someone worth recognizing. Chapter 10. The Challenge. The great throne room had been transformed into an arena of judgment, its soaring columns draped with banners that proclaimed the ancient laws governing trials by combat. Word of the challenge had spread through the palace like wildfire, drawing every noble family, every court official, and every person of influence who could claim the right to witness what promised to be the most significant confrontation in living memory. Lyra stood at the challenger's position, her recently awakened power contained within human form, but radiating outward in waves that made the air itself seem to shimmer with potential violence. The wolf spirit that had finally achieved full manifestation prowled beneath her skin, eager for the chance to prove their worth against the woman who had dared to threaten their mate, bond and their rightful place in the kingdom's hierarchy. Across the polished marble floor, Lady Seraphina occupied the defendant's circle with all the poise and confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Her golden hair was braided with silver wire and precious gems that caught the light like captured stars, and her ceremonial armour had been crafted by the finest artificers in the eastern provinces. But more than her physical preparation, more than the magical enhancements that glowed softly around her frame, was the cold determination that burned in her perfect features. She had borrowed power from sources that made Elder Thane's expression tighten with disapproval, had made bargains with magical entities that left traces of corruption around her aura like smoke from a poisoned fire. She was no longer just the beautiful noblewoman whose political marriage would unite territories and secure peace. She had become something else, something willing to pay any price to claim the crown she believed was rightfully hers. "The terms are clear," Elder Thane announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "Trial by combat to determine the rightful claimant to the position of Alpha King Kale's mate and future queen. Victory shall be determined by surrender, incapacitation, or death of one combatant. The supernatural companions of each participant are permitted to assist in accordance with ancient law." At Lyra's side, the Shadowmane had taken its place with the patience of something that had waited 2 centuries for this moment of vindication. The great creature's presence dominated the space around them, its star-bright eyes fixed on Seraphina with the kind of predatory focus that promised swift justice for those who had dared to threaten its chosen princess. Seraphina's own companion was a creature of borrowed power rather than earned loyalty, a spectral dragon she had summoned through dark pacts and bound to her service through methods that made the assembled nobles whisper among themselves with unease. The ghostly beast coiled around her position like smoke given form and malevolent purpose, its hollow eye sockets blazing with unnatural fire. From his position at the edge of the combat circle, Alpha King Kyle watched with an expression that revealed nothing of the storm raging behind his golden-flecked eyes. The mate bond between him and Lyra sang with shared tension and desperate love, but ancient law forbade him from interfering in a challenge that would determine his own future. He was forced to remain a spectator while the two women who claimed the right to stand beside him fought for a prize that his heart had already chosen. Fenris pressed against his bonded partner's side, the great wolf's own agitation evident in every line of his powerful frame. Through their connection, Kyle could sense his companion's confusion and frustration at being forbidden to aid the one they both recognized as their true queen. The signal to begin came not from horn or bell, but from the sudden silence that fell over the assembled witnesses as anticipation reached its breaking point. Seraphina moved first, her borrowed power manifesting as bolts of crackling energy that sought to overwhelm her opponent through raw magical force. The spectral dragon at her side unleashed gouts of ghostly flame that turned the air itself into a weapon designed to consume anything it touched. But Lyra had spent 19 years learning to endure, learning to survive, learning to find strength in places others never thought to look. The power that flowed through her bloodline was not borrowed or bargained for, or stolen from entities that demanded payment in corruption. It was hers by birthright, earned through suffering, purified by the recognition of creatures whose loyalty could not be bought or coerced. She met Seraphina's opening assault with grace that belonged to queens who had ruled when the world was young, deflecting magical attacks with movements that seemed almost like dance. The Shadowmane moved in perfect synchronization with her, its massive form flowing around the combat circle with predatory purpose that made the spectral dragon's borrowed power seem pale and insubstantial by comparison. "You fight like someone who has never truly earned anything," Lyra said, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber, despite the magical forces crackling between them. "Power stolen from others will always fail when it meets strength that comes from within." Seraphina's response was a snarl of fury as she channeled more energy from her dark pacts, her beautiful features twisting with the strain of wielding forces that were never meant for human vessels. The spectral dragon grew larger and more solid as she fed it power from her own life force, trading years of her existence for temporary advantage in a battle that would determine everything she had worked to achieve. But borrowed power came with borrowed weaknesses, and the supernatural creatures bound to her service through coercion rather than love carried no loyalty that would endure when the tide of battle turned against her. As Lyra's own strength continued to build, as the Shadowmane's presence reminded every witness of bonds that transcended political arrangement, cracks began to appear in the foundation of Seraphina's artificial supremacy. The turning point came when the spectral dragon, weakened by its unnatural existence and the corruption of its summoning, faltered under the combined pressure of royal bloodline magic and the Shadowmane's ancient fury. The ghostly creature's form began to dissolve back into the ethereal realm from which it had been torn, leaving Seraphina suddenly alone against opponents whose power drew from sources far older and more fundamental than any dark pact. "Impossible!" she gasped, staggering as the backlash of her companion's dissolution tore through her magical defences. "I have paid everything for this power. I have sacrificed everything to claim what should be mine by right of birth and position." "But you have never earned anything through love," Lyra replied, advancing with the Shadowmane at her side. "You have never commanded loyalty through compassion, never inspired devotion through sacrifice for others rather than yourself. That is why your borrowed power fails, and why mine grows stronger with every moment." The final exchange was swift and decisive. Seraphina launched herself forward with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose, her remaining magical energy focused into a blade of pure force that could cut through any physical defense. But she was facing an opponent whose strength came not from individual power alone, but from connections that linked her to every supernatural creature in the kingdom. Lyra caught the energy blade bare-handed, her royal bloodline magic neutralizing the attack with ease that made Seraphina's eyes widen in disbelief. The shadow mane moved behind the faltering noblewoman with fluid grace, cutting off any possibility of retreat or escape. "Yield," Lyra said, her voice carrying the authority that came with acknowledgement from creatures whose judgment could not be corrupted by politics or ambition. "Acknowledge what everyone in this chamber can see, that your claim was built on lies and your power on foundations that crumble when tested against truth." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Seraphina stood frozen between the promise of mercy and the pride that had driven her to risk everything for a crown she would never possess. The assembled witnesses held their breath, waiting to see whether she would choose wisdom or continue the destructive path that had already cost her everything she had claimed to value. The spectral dragon's final dissolution sent waves of magical backlash through her system, and she collapsed to her knees with blood streaming from her nose and ears. The borrowed power that had sustained her through the challenge was gone, leaving behind only a broken woman whose schemes had finally met their inevitable end. "I yield," she whispered, the words barely audible, but carrying clearly in the profound silence that had fallen over the throne room. "I acknowledge the superior claim of the Starweaver bloodline." The formal declaration sent ripples of reaction through the assembled nobles, some gasping in amazement, while others nodded with satisfaction at seeing ancient laws properly observed. But Lyra barely heard the political implications of her victory, barely registered the way court alliances were already shifting to accommodate the new reality. Her attention was fixed on the golden-flecked eyes that blazed with love and triumph from the edge of the combat circle, on the mate bond that sang with shared joy at the resolution of obstacles that had kept them apart. Alpha King Kyle stepped forward with movements that spoke of careful control, barely containing explosive relief, and she knew that nothing would ever again stand between them and the destiny they were meant to claim together. The lost princess had proven her worth in combat, witnessed by the entire court. The rightful queen had claimed her place through strength that none could dispute, and the mate bond that had called to both of them since their first meeting could finally be acknowledged without political consequences or legal complications. But even as victory settled around her like a royal cloak, even as she prepared to step into the role she had been born to fill, Lyra felt the weight of responsibility that came with power earned rather than inherited. The kingdom would need healing from the wounds that Seraphina's ambitions had opened, and that healing would require wisdom and compassion rather than simple strength. Chapter 11. The True Bonding. The sacred grove had stood unchanged for 1,000 years, its ancient oaks bearing witness to royal ceremonies that predated the current kingdom by centuries. Moonlight filtered through leaves that rustled with more than earthly wind, and the very air hummed with power that seemed to rise from the earth itself to bless unions that transcended mortal politics. Lyra walked the winding path toward the ceremonial circle, with her heart beating a rhythm that matched the pulse of magic flowing through the consecrated ground beneath her feet. She was no longer dressed in servant's garb or makeshift royal attire, but in gowns that had been crafted by the finest seamstresses in the kingdom, working through the night to create something worthy of a queen whose bloodline connected her to the very foundations of their world. The dress was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk embroidered with silver threads that caught the moonlight like captured stars. Ancient symbols worked into the fabric told the story of the Starweaver bloodline in a language older than written words, each thread placement deliberate and meaningful in ways that spoke to supernatural creatures whose memory stretched back to the kingdom's founding. But more than her physical transformation, more than the royal regalia that proclaimed her rightful status, was the presence she commanded as she approached the sacred space where her destiny waited. The power that had awakened during her trials blazed around her like visible starfire, marking her as someone whose authority came not from political appointment, but from recognition by forces that predated human civilization. The Shadowmane padded beside her with the satisfaction of a creature whose patient loyalty had finally been rewarded. Other war beasts had gathered among the ancient trees to witness the ceremony, their supernatural senses drawn by the significance of bonds being acknowledged that would reshape the balance of power throughout the realm. At the centre of the grove, Alpha King Kyle waited with composure that barely contained the storm of emotion blazing in his golden-flecked eyes. He wore ceremonial robes that emphasized rather than concealed the raw physical power that had made him legendary among warriors. But tonight his strength served a purpose far more important than conquest or dominance. Tonight he would claim his true mate before witnesses whose judgment could not be influenced by politics or ambition. Fenris stood at his bonded partner's side, the great wolf's pale blue eyes bright with satisfaction as he watched the approach of the one they had both recognized as their destined queen. Through their connection, Kyle could feel his companion's joy at the resolution of conflicts that had threatened to tear them all apart. Elder Thane occupied the ceremonial position reserved for the kingdom's highest magical authority, his scholarly robes replaced by vestments that marked him as qualified to officiate at rituals that bridged the supernatural and human worlds. The ancient text spread before him contained words that had been spoken at royal bonding ceremonies since the first Starweaver king had claimed his supernatural mate beneath stars that still shone overhead. The assembled witnesses represented every major family and faction in the kingdom, their presence ensuring that no one could later claim the ceremony lacked proper authority or legal standing. But more significant than the human observers were the supernatural creatures that had gathered to acknowledge bonds that their kinds understood in ways that transcended political calculation. As Lyra reached the edge of the ceremonial circle, the mate bond between her and Kyle surged with recognition that made the very air around them shimmer with golden light. They had waited for this moment through trials and tribulations that had tested every aspect of their commitment, and now nothing stood between them and the destiny they were meant to claim together. "Who brings this woman to be joined in sacred bonding?" Elder Thane intoned, his voice carrying the weight of ritual that connected them to centuries of royal tradition. The Shadowmane stepped forward with dignity that belonged to creatures whose loyalty could not be bought or coerced. When it spoke, its mental voice resonated through the consciousness of every supernatural being present, marking its words as testimony that would be remembered by their kinds for generations to come. "I bring the last daughter of the Starweaver line, the princess whose blood carries the original bonds that united our peoples, the queen whose recognition by my kind proves her worthiness to rule over both human and supernatural subjects." The formal acknowledgement sent ripples of power through the sacred grove as ancient magics responded to truths being spoken in the proper place and manner. Trees that had stood since the kingdom's founding rustled their leaves in approval, and the very ground seemed to pulse with energy that blessed unions forged in love rather than political necessity. Kyle stepped forward to meet her at the circle's edge, and when their hands touched, golden light erupted around them both with intensity that made every witness understand they were seeing something that belonged in the realm of legend rather than contemporary ceremony. The mate bond that had called to them since their first meeting completed itself with a resonance that could be felt across impossible distances, announcing to every supernatural creature in the kingdom that their true rulers had finally found each other. "I claim this woman as my mate," Kale said, his voice carrying clearly through the sacred grove. "Not because politics demands it, not because alliances require it, but because the universe itself has written our names together in starlight and destiny." "And I claim this man as mine," Lyra replied, her own words blazing with power that made the ancient symbols embroidered on her gown glow with inner light. "Not because bloodline requires it, not because duty demands it, but because my soul recognizes his across every lifetime and circumstance." Elder Thane raised his hands toward the star-filled sky, calling upon forces that predated human understanding to witness and bless the union taking place beneath their eternal watch. By the authority vested in me by the crown and the ancient laws that govern bonds between souls destined to stand as one, I proclaim this couple mated in the eyes of gods and mortals alike. The words released power that had been building throughout the ceremony, like water breaking through a dam. Golden light poured from the joined hands of the royal couple, washing over the assembled witnesses in waves that carried blessing and recognition and the promise of a future built on love rather than political calculation. But the true moment of completion came not with spoken words or ritual gestures, but with the kiss that sealed their bond before every supernatural creature whose memory would carry this moment forward through the generations. When their lips met, when the mate bond achieved its final consummation, the very fabric of reality seemed to shift around them as destiny claimed what had always belonged together. The war beasts gathered among the ancient trees responded with calls and cries that proclaimed their acceptance of the new order, their voices rising in harmonies that had not been heard since the original Starweaver bloodline had ruled with wisdom and compassion. Even the trees themselves seemed to lean toward the royal couple, their branches reaching out to offer blessing from forces older than human civilization. As the golden light gradually faded, as the echoes of supernatural recognition settled into new patterns that would define the kingdom's future, Lyra felt the profound rightness of standing beside the one soul in all the world that was meant to complement her own. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and endured cruelty was gone, replaced by someone whose power and position had been earned through trials that tested every aspect of her character. But more than the transformation from invisibility to royalty, more than the journey from powerlessness to command over forces that could reshape nations, was the simple joy of being seen and accepted and loved for exactly who she was meant to be. Kyle's arms encircled her as their first moments as acknowledged mates stretched into the kind of perfect contentment that made all their struggles worthwhile. Through their completed bond, she could feel his thoughts and emotions as clearly as her own, could sense the depth of love that had driven him to risk everything for the chance to claim her as his queen. "We have much work ahead of us," he murmured against her ear, his voice carrying undertones of the passion that blazed between them. "The kingdom will need healing from the wounds that politics and ambition have opened, and that healing will require both strength and wisdom." "Then we will heal it together," she replied, her hand finding his with the certainty that came from bonds that could not be broken by any force in the mortal realm. "As we were meant to do from the moment the universe wrote our names in starlight." The sacred grove settled into peaceful stillness as the witnesses began to disperse, carrying word of the true royal bonding to every corner of the kingdom. But the royal couple remained in the circle where their destiny had finally been acknowledged, holding each other beneath stars that had watched over Starweaver bloodline ceremonies for more than 1,000 years. Tomorrow would bring the responsibilities and challenges that came with ruling a kingdom whose supernatural and human subjects needed leaders who understood both worlds. But tonight belonged to love triumphant, to bonds acknowledged, to the completion of a journey that had transformed them both from what they had been into, what they were meant to become together. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. 6 months had passed since the sacred bonding ceremony that had united the lost princess with her destined mate, and the kingdom bore witness to a transformation that touched every corner of the realm. From her position on the palace balcony, Queen Lyra watched the morning sun paint the training grounds below in shades of gold and amber, its light catching on the forms of young nobles learning to work alongside supernatural companions rather than simply commanding them through force or magical coercion. The change in the kingdom's approach to war beast partnerships had been one of many reforms that followed naturally from having rulers who understood both worlds intimately. Where once the creatures had been treated as weapons to be wielded or trophies to be claimed, they were now recognized as partners whose wisdom and loyalty could only be earned through mutual respect and genuine affection. She placed her hand on the gentle curve of her belly, where new life grew beneath the silk of her mourning gown. The heir to the Starweaver bloodline would be born into a world very different from the one she had known as a servant girl scrubbing floors in war beast stables. This child would grow up knowing exactly who they were, surrounded by love instead of cruelty, acknowledged from birth rather than hidden away in shadows and lies. The baby quickened beneath her touch, and she felt Kale's awareness spike through their mate bond as he sensed the movement from his position in the council chambers below. Even separated by stone and distance, they remained connected by ties that strengthened rather than faded with time, their souls intertwined in ways that made shared rule feel as natural as breathing. "Your Majesty?" The soft voice belonged to Elena, the young woman who had been elevated from kitchen servant to royal attendant based on kindness shown during Lyra's darkest hours. The transformation in the palace hierarchy had been comprehensive, with merit and compassion valued far more highly than bloodline connections or political influence. "The morning audiences are ready to begin whenever you wish," Elena continued, her tone carrying the comfortable familiarity that came from months of working together. "Lord Aldrich requests permission to present his son's betrothal proposal to Lady Morgana, and the Eastern Province delegation has arrived with the trade agreements you requested." Lyra nodded, but made no immediate move to leave her contemplation of the transformed world below. The political marriages that had once been arranged purely for territorial advantage were now evaluated based on compatibility and genuine affection, with supernatural recognition playing a significant role in determining which unions would strengthen the kingdom rather than simply consolidating power. "There's also a message from the Shadowmane," Elena added, with the slight smile that always accompanied mentions of the legendary creature who had become something of a palace fixture. "He wishes to inform you that the newest batch of warbeast eggs will be hatching within the fortnight, and he would like your presence at the bonding ceremonies." The ancient creature's involvement in raising the next generation of supernatural companions had been another unexpected development in the kingdom's transformation. Where once warbeasts had been captured and trained through force, they were now raised from birth in partnership with humans whose bloodlines carried the potential for genuine bonding. The Shadowmane had become both teacher and protector to these younger creatures, ensuring they understood the difference between earned loyalty and demanded obedience. A familiar presence approached through the palace corridors, and Lyra felt her heart lift as she sensed Kale's approach through their bond. The council session had ended earlier than expected, leaving him free to join her morning contemplation of their transformed realm. He emerged onto the balcony with the quiet grace that marked all his movements, his golden-flecked eyes brightening as they found hers across the space that separated them. 6 months of shared rule had only deepened the connection between them, their partnership stronger for having been tested by trials that could have destroyed a bond built on anything less substantial than soul-deep recognition. "The Eastern delegation is impressed with our reforms," he said, as he moved to stand beside her at the balcony railing. "They're requesting similar changes to their own warbeast programs, and they're offering trade advantages in exchange for advisors who can help implement the new bonding protocols." It was a conversation they had had many times in recent months, as neighbouring kingdoms recognised the benefits of treating supernatural creatures as partners rather than property. The changes that had begun with one servant girl's recognition by an ancient war beast were spreading across the known world, carried by merchants and diplomats who witnessed the prosperity that came from harmony between human and supernatural forces. "Lord Garrett has successfully bonded with one of the young ironback wyverns," Kale continued, his voice carrying satisfaction at the achievement of someone who had once been considered a failure. The creature chose him not for his magical power or family connections, but because it sensed his genuine desire to protect rather than dominate. The old man would be proud to see his son's growth. Lyra leaned into her husband's embrace as his arms encircled her from behind, his hands coming to rest over hers on the curve where their child grew. Through their bond, she shared his memories of the morning's council session, experiencing second-hand the pride he felt in their subject's adaptation to the new ways of approaching supernatural partnerships. "Seraphina has requested an audience," he said quietly, his mental voice carrying undertones of concern through their connection. The former noblewoman had spent the past 6 months in exile, her family's lands placed under royal stewardship while she contemplated the choices that had led to her downfall. "She wishes to formally request permission to return to court," Kyle continued. "Her letters suggest genuine repentance for her actions, and the reports from her exile indicate she has been working with local communities to repair damage caused by her previous magical experimenting." The question of forgiveness had been one they had discussed many times since ascending to joint rule. Justice demanded acknowledgement of wrongs committed, but wisdom suggested that redemption should be possible for those who genuinely sought it. Seraphina's crimes had been serious, but they had been driven by desperation and political ambition rather than inherent cruelty. "What does your heart tell you?" Lyra asked, though she suspected she already knew his answer. Kyle's capacity for mercy had been one of the qualities that made him beloved by their subjects, his ability to see potential for growth in even those who had opposed him. "That people can change, given the proper motivation and guidance," he replied. "That denying redemption to those who seek it genuinely would make us the kind of rulers who inspire fear rather than love." It was the kind of wisdom that came from understanding power as responsibility rather than privilege, from recognizing that true strength lay in lifting others up rather than keeping them down. The servant girl who had once cleaned war-beast stables understood better than most how circumstances could trap people in roles that didn't reflect their true potential. "Then we will hear her petition," Lyra decided, "but any return to court will be conditional on demonstrated commitment to the new ways we have established. She will need to prove through actions rather than words that she has learned from her mistakes." The decision felt right in the way that all their best choices did, resonating through the mate bond with the harmony that came from souls in perfect alignment. They had built their reign on the principle that everyone deserved the chance to become better than they had been, and extending that principle to former enemies was simply the logical extension of beliefs that had transformed their kingdom. A soft knock at the balcony doors announced Elena's return, her expression carrying the gentle urgency that marked truly important news. "Your Majesties, forgive the interruption, but there's been a development that requires your immediate attention." They turned as one, their shared concern flowing through the bond as they prepared for whatever challenge might threaten the peace they had worked so hard to establish. But Elena's expression held excitement rather than worry, her smile bright with the kind of joy that came from witnessing something miraculous. "The Shadowmane requests your presence in the stables immediately," she said, her voice dancing with barely contained delight. "One of the ancient eggs has begun to hatch ahead of schedule, and the creature is calling for its chosen partner. It appears to be seeking someone with royal bloodline resonance." The implications were staggering. If one of the legendary creatures was responding to the presence of their unborn heir, if the bonds that connected the Starweaver line to supernatural beings could manifest even before birth, then the child growing within Lyra's womb was destined for connection to forces that predated human civilization by millennia. They made their way through the palace corridors with eager haste, their steps quickened by anticipation of witnessing something that belonged in the realm of prophecy rather than daily experience. The war-beast stables had been transformed from the harsh environment Lyra remembered into spaces that celebrated the dignity and intelligence of their supernatural residents, but the section housing the ancient eggs remained unchanged in its reverent simplicity. The Shadowmane waited for them beside an egg that pulsed with inner light, its massive form radiating satisfaction at developments that exceeded even its ancient expectations. When the great creature spoke, its mental voice carried warmth that encompassed them both in welcome and recognition. "The little one calls to its destined partner," the Shadowmane explained, its star-bright eyes fixed on the curve of Lyra's belly where new life stirred with increasing urgency. "The bonds that unite your bloodline to ours recognize the strength that grows within the royal heir, and they seek to establish connection that will endure across lifetimes." As if responding to the creature's words, the egg began to crack with hairline fractures that spread like golden lightning across its ancient surface. The light that emerged was soft and welcoming rather than harsh, carrying resonance that made Lyra's unborn child quicken with recognition of something that would be friend and protector and partner throughout the adventures that lay ahead. When the baby dragon finally emerged from its shell, when its jewel-bright eyes found theirs across the stable space, Lyra felt a connection form that transcended her own bonds with supernatural creatures. This was not her companion, but her child's, and through the mate bond she shared Kael's wonder at witnessing the birth of a partnership that would define the next generation of their bloodline. "What shall we call you, little one?" she whispered to the creature that would spend its life protecting and serving the heir to the Starweaver throne. The dragon's response came not in words, but in images that painted themselves across her consciousness. Starlight dancing on water, the sound of wind through ancient forests, the feeling of coming home to a place you had never left. And in those images she found a name that felt as right as everything else in this new world they had built together. "Stellaris," she said, and both the dragon and the child within her womb responded to the name with recognition that resonated through every supernatural creature in the kingdom. The transformation was complete. The lost princess, who had once believed herself to be nothing, had become a queen whose bloodline promised continued harmony between human and supernatural worlds. The servant girl who had cleaned stables had given birth to reforms that would echo through generations yet to come. And in the gentle curve of new life growing beneath her heart, in the mate bond that connected her to the one soul meant to stand beside hers, in the recognition of creatures whose loyalty could not be bought or coerced, but only earned through love, she had found something worth more than any crown or throne or political power. She had found home. Chapter 2. The Ancient Beast Stirs. The morning arrived with cruel efficiency, dragging Lyra from dreams filled with starlight and running paws. She woke with the taste of wild wind still on her tongue, and the phantom sensation of power flowing through limbs that felt too small, too weak to contain what her sleeping mind had experienced. The dreams were getting stronger, more vivid, as if something long dormant was stirring to life in the depths of her consciousness. She dressed quickly in her servant's uniform and made her way through the pre-dawn corridors toward the war beast stables. The compound felt different today, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her pulse quicken. In 2 days, the bonding trials would begin, and already she could sense the anticipation building like pressure before a storm. Magnus was waiting for her in the main corridor, his expression darker than usual as he watched her approach. "You're late," he said, though she knew she wasn't. Punctuality was one of the few things she had never struggled with, a survival skill learned early in a world that punished any excuse for criticism. "My apologies, sir," she said, keeping her voice neutral and her eyes downcast. But even as she spoke, she felt a pull toward the far end of the stables, toward the section that housed the Shadowmane. The memory of those ancient eyes and that impossible word still burned in her mind like a brand. "Today you'll be cleaning the Shadowmane's enclosure," Magnus said, and her head snapped up in surprise. He smiled at her reaction, but there was no warmth in it, only the cold satisfaction of someone about to watch another person suffer. "The beast has been unusually active lately, restless, The barriers need to be cleaned and the protective runes renewed before the trials begin. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the implications sank in. Sir, I've never been assigned to that section before. Perhaps someone more experienced should. Are you questioning my judgment, servant girl? His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that made the nearest war beasts shift uneasily in their enclosures. The Shadowmane hasn't killed anyone in 3 years. It's practically domesticated by now. Besides, if something does happen to you, it's not like anyone would miss a cursed blood foundling with no family to mourn her. The words should have stung, but Lyra found herself oddly detached from their cruelty. Instead, she was thinking about the way the ancient creature had looked at her last night, the recognition that had passed between them like lightning jumping between storm clouds. Whatever was going to happen when she entered that enclosure, she didn't think death was the most likely outcome. "Of course, sir," she said. "I'll begin immediately." Magnus handed her a bucket of cleaning supplies and a small bag of salt for renewing the protective runes. "The barriers stay up at all times," he warned. "You clean from outside the enclosure, reach through the gaps in the bars, and if that monster so much as looks at you wrong, you run. The last thing I need is to explain to the Alpha King why his trials were delayed because a servant got herself eaten." She nodded and made her way toward the forbidden section, her footsteps echoing in the stone corridors. Behind her, she could hear Magnus muttering about cursed blood and unnatural behaviour, but his voice faded as distance and her own thundering heartbeat drowned out everything else. The Shadowmane's enclosure looked different in daylight, though the magical twilight maintained within its barriers meant that difference was subtle. She could see more details of the creature's domain now, ancient stone carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, patches of earth that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and in the centre of it all, a massive form that moved with liquid grace despite its tremendous size. The Shadowmane was awake and waiting for her. She could feel its attention like a physical weight as she approached the barrier, could see those star-bright eyes tracking her movement with an intensity that should have been terrifying. Instead, she found herself oddly calm as she set down her cleaning supplies and began working. The protective runes carved into the iron bars were complex things, layered with centuries of accumulated magic, designed to contain something that had once served the greatest kings in their history. As she traced their patterns with salt-dampened fingers, renewing their power according to Magnus's instructions, she felt an odd resonance in the symbols, as if they recognized her touch, welcomed it even. "That's impossible," she whispered to herself, but the runes continued to glow with renewed vigour under her ministrations, responding to her presence in ways that defied everything she knew about magical theory. The Shadowmane approached the barrier as she worked, moving with the kind of deliberate caution reserved for something too important to rush. It settled into a resting position just on the other side of the bars, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from its massive form, could hear the deep rhythm of its breathing. But it made no aggressive moves, showed none of the violent hostility that had marked its interactions with every other person who had dared to enter its domain. Instead, it simply watched her work with those ancient, knowing eyes. "I don't understand," she found herself saying, though she hadn't meant to speak aloud. "Everyone says you're dangerous. They say you've killed warriors who were stronger and braver and better than I could ever be. So why aren't you trying to kill me?" The great head tilted, and she could have sworn she saw amusement flicker across features that should have been incapable of such human expressions. When the Shadowmane spoke, its voice resonated not through her ears, but through her bones, a vibration that seemed to come from inside her own chest. "Because you are not them, little princess. You are something they could never be." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her hands shake as she tried to continue working. "I'm not a princess," she said, but even as the denial left her lips, she felt how hollow it sounded. "I'm nobody, I'm nothing, just a servant with cursed blood and no family to claim." The Shadowmane made a sound that might have been laughter, deep and rumbling and filled with ancient wisdom. You believe the lies they told you, the stories they created to keep you small, keep you safe, keep you from remembering what you truly are. But blood calls to blood, child of starlight, and yours sings with power they cannot silence forever. Stop, she whispered, pressing her hands against her ears as if she could block out words that came from inside her own mind. Stop saying things that can't be true. But even as she spoke, memories were stirring. Not her own memories, but something deeper and more primal. Images of running through forests under moonlight, of power flowing through her veins like molten gold, of a voice calling her name across vast distances, and underneath it all, the bone-deep certainty that she was meant for something more than scrubbing floors and enduring cruelty. The other war beasts were responding to whatever was happening between her and the Shadowmane. She could hear them stirring in their enclosures throughout the stable complex, could feel their attention turning toward her like flowers following the sun. A few of the bonded creatures began making soft sounds of recognition, as if greeting someone they had been waiting to meet. The Shadow Lynx twins from yesterday appeared at the edge of their enclosure, pressing against their own barriers with an urgency that made their bonded warriors call out in confusion from the training yards. A young griffin left its perch to pace the length of its domain, golden eyes fixed on her with laser intensity. Even the ironback wyvern, normally as still as carved stone during daylight hours, raised its massive head to track her movement. They can sense it too, the Shadowmane said, and this time she didn't try to deny what she was hearing. The truth that beats in your heart like a second pulse. They know what you are, even if you do not yet remember. Lyra set down her cleaning cloth with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The logical part of her mind was screaming that this was impossible, that ancient war beasts didn't speak in human minds, that servant girls with no bloodline didn't suddenly develop supernatural connections to legendary creatures. But logic was being overwhelmed by something far more powerful, the growing certainty that everything she had been told about herself was a carefully constructed lie. "If I'm not who I think I am," she said slowly, "then who am I really?" The last daughter of the Starweaver line, the princess who was hidden in plain sight to protect her from those who murdered her parents, the one whose power was bound with such skill that even she forgot what she carried within her blood. The words hit her like lightning, illuminating corners of her mind that had been dark for as long as she could remember. Suddenly, fragments of dreams and half-remembered images began clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was trying to solve. The way magic responded to her touch, the way war beasts watched her with recognition instead of indifference, the persistent feeling that she was living someone else's life, wearing someone else's skin. "The Starweaver line died out," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Everyone knows that. They were killed in the Plague Wars 2 centuries ago. Not all of them. One child survived, spirited away by those loyal to the crown, her power locked away and her memories altered to keep her safe until she was strong enough to reclaim what was taken." The Shadowmane's mental voice was gentle now, almost tender. "You have been waiting for this moment your entire life, little princess. Waiting for someone to speak your true name and watch you remember who you were born to be." As if summoned by the creature's words, a vision exploded across her consciousness with the force of a breaking dam. She saw herself as a small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, standing in a throne room filled with golden light. A woman with silver hair and eyes like starfire knelt before her, pressing something cold and metallic into her tiny hands. "Remember who you are, my darling," the woman whispered, and Lyra realized with shocking clarity that she was looking at her mother. Her real mother. Not the foundling story she had been told, but royal blood and ancient power and a legacy that had been stolen from her before she was old enough to understand what she was losing. "Hide her where they will never think to look," another voice said, male and urgent. "Make her forget, make her invisible, make her safe. But when the time comes, when she is strong enough and the kingdom has need of her, The blood will remember. The power will return. The vision shattered like glass, leaving her gasping and disoriented in the present moment. But the knowledge remained, burning in her mind like a newly lit flame. She was not nobody. She was not nothing. She was the lost princess of the Star Weaver line, hidden among servants and foundlings for 19 years, while her birthright waited for her to reclaim it. "Why now?" she whispered to the Shadowmane, who continued watching her with those ancient, patient eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the time of hiding is ending," the creature replied. "Because your mate approaches, and the bonds that have kept you small and safe are beginning to break under the weight of what you truly are. Because in 2 days the kingdom will witness the return of their lost princess, whether you choose to remember or not." "My mate?" The question escaped before she could stop it, and she felt heat rush to her cheeks at the implications. The Shadowmane's amusement was like warm honey flowing through her consciousness. The Alpha King searches for his destined war beast, not knowing that his true prize has been cleaning the creature's cage for months. When our eyes meet his across the arena, when he feels the pull of recognition through the mate bond that has been calling to him since the day you both drew breath, he will understand what the kingdom has forgotten. What you have forgotten. Alpha King Kyle, the golden ruler who commanded respect from every corner of the realm, whose strength and wisdom had brought peace to territories that had known only war for generations. The man who was meant to mate with the perfect, beautiful, noble-born Seraphina in a ceremony that would unite bloodlines and secure political alliances for decades to come. The idea that someone like her could be meant for someone like him was so absurd it should have made her laugh. But instead she felt a deep resonance in her chest, a recognition that went beyond conscious thought, as if somewhere in the depths of her being a part of her had always known this truth and been waiting for the rest of her to catch up. "This is insane," she said, but she was already rising to her feet, already turning toward the stable entrance where she could hear the sounds of the day's activities beginning. "I can't be a princess. I can't be anyone's mate. I'm just... "You are exactly who you have always been," the Shadowmane said with infinite gentleness. "You have simply forgotten that who you are is extraordinary." As she gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave the ancient creature's domain, Lyra felt the world shifting around her like tectonic plates, finding new positions. Nothing looked different, but everything felt changed, as if she was seeing her surroundings through new eyes that could perceive truths that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. The war beasts throughout the stable complex were still stirring, still watching her with that strange new awareness. But now she understood what she was seeing in their ancient eyes. Not confusion or mere curiosity, but recognition. They knew what she was, even if the rest of the world had forgotten. In 2 days, the bonding trials would begin. In 2 days, Alpha King Kyle would enter the arena seeking his destined companion. And in 2 days, Lyra would discover whether she had the courage to step out of the shadows she had hidden in for 19 years and claim the destiny that had been waiting for her to remember it existed. But first, she had to survive the growing storm she could feel building in her chest, the power that was stirring to life like a dragon awakening from centuries of sleep. She had to learn to be someone other than the invisible servant girl who cleaned up after her betters. She had to learn to be a princess. Chapter 3. The Bonding Trials. Begin. The morning of the bonding trials dawned clear and bright, as if the very heavens had conspired to provide perfect conditions for the spectacle that would reshape the kingdom's future. Lyra woke before sunrise, her dreams still echoing with the Shadowmane's revelations and the impossible weight of a destiny she wasn't sure she was ready to claim. The knowledge of her true identity burned in her chest like a coal that refused to cool, transforming every familiar detail of her small world into something strange and new. She dressed in her cleanest servant's uniform and braided her dark hair with hands that trembled only slightly. Today, she would serve refreshments to the noble spectators while they witnessed history in the making. Today, she would watch from the sidelines as Alpha King Kyle chose his destined war beast, solidifying his claim to the throne and his future with the perfect Lady Seraphina. Today, she would pretend to be nothing while every fibre of her being screamed that she was meant to be everything. The arena had been transformed overnight into something magnificent and terrible. Ancient stone circles that normally lay dormant beneath protective barriers now thrummed with power, their carved surfaces glowing with runic inscriptions that hurt to look at directly. Temporary seating had been erected in rising tiers around the central space, creating a natural amphitheatre that could accommodate thousands of witnesses to the trials ahead. Already, despite the early hour, people were arriving in streams of silk and jewels and carefully controlled magical auras. The noble families came first, claiming the prime seating with the casual arrogance of those born to privilege. Behind them came the wealthy merchants and guild masters who had purchased their way into witnessing history. And filling the remaining spaces were the common folk who had travelled from distant provinces for the chance to see their Alpha King choose his companion. Lyra made her way through the servant corridors that ran beneath the arena seating, her arms laden with trays of delicate pastries and crystal goblets filled with ceremonial wine. The kitchen staff had been working since before dawn to prepare refreshments worthy of such an august gathering, and now it fell to the serving girls to ensure that every noble palate was satisfied while the trials unfolded. She emerged into the bright morning light at the base of the eastern seating section, immediately feeling the weight of 10,000 eyes upon the arena floor. The central space was vast enough to accommodate the largest war beasts in the kingdom's collection, with barrier spells shimmering like heat waves around the perimeter to protect the spectators from any violence that might spill beyond the designated boundaries. The contestants were already assembling in a staging area beside the main arena. Lyra could see them from her position near the refreshment stations, young nobles dressed in ceremonial armour, their faces painted with ritual markings that proclaimed their bloodlines and their intentions. Lord Aldrich's son stood near the centre of the group, his massive frame enhanced by the kind of magical augmentation that only the wealthiest families could afford. Lady Morgana paced at the edge of the gathering, her silver hair braided with charms that glowed with subtle power. And somewhere among them, though she couldn't see him from this angle, was Alpha King Kyle himself, the ruler whose very presence could command attention from every corner of a room, whose strength and wisdom had brought peace to a realm that had known only conflict for generations. The man who was meant to choose his war beast today and mate with Seraphina tomorrow in a ceremony that would unite bloodlines and secure political alliances for decades to come. The man who, according to a legendary creature that spoke in her mind, was somehow destined to be her mate. The thought was absurd enough to make her hands shake as she arranged crystal goblets on silver trays. She was a servant, a foundling, a nobody who had spent 19 years being invisible to everyone who mattered. The idea that she could be meant for someone like Kyle was so ridiculous it should have made her laugh. But instead of amusement, she felt that familiar pull in her chest, the same resonance that had drawn her to the Shadowmane's enclosure night after night. As if somewhere deep in her bones, a part of her recognised a truth her conscious mind couldn't accept. "You there, girl." The sharp voice cut through her racing thoughts like a blade. "Bring wine to the Eastern Pavilion. Lady Seraphina has arrived." Lyra looked up to see one of the head servants pointing toward an elaborate silk canopy that had been erected in the most prominent section of the arena seating. Beneath its shade, a small crowd of noble attendants bustled around a figure who commanded attention simply by existing. Lady Seraphina was even more beautiful in person than Lyra remembered from their previous encounter. Her golden hair fell in perfect waves down her back, catching the morning sunlight like spun metal. Her gown was a masterpiece of celestial blue silk that matched her eyes exactly, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that echoed the flight paths of the celestial hawks she planned to bond with during the trials. She moved with the kind of effortless grace that came from a lifetime of knowing exactly who she was and what she was worth. She was everything a queen should be, everything Lyra could never hope to become. "Of course, ma'am," Lyra said to the head servant, gathering a selection of the finest wines and making her way toward the eastern pavilion. As she approached, she could hear fragments of conversation from Seraphina's attendants, their voices pitched low, but carrying the kind of excitement that came with proximity to power. "The Alpha King arrived just after dawn," one of them was saying. "They say he spent the night in meditation, preparing himself to recognize his destined companion among the war beasts. And after he bonds successfully, the mating ceremony tomorrow will be the grandest celebration our kingdom has seen in generations," another added. "Lady Seraphina will make such a beautiful queen." "Excuse me, my lady," Lyra said softly, approaching the edge of the pavilion with her tray of wines. "Refreshments from the kitchens." Seraphina turned toward her, and for a moment their eyes met directly. Up close, the noble woman was even more striking, but there was something in her gaze that made Lyra's skin crawl. A coldness that existed just beneath the surface beauty, like ice covering deep water. "How thoughtful," Seraphina said, her voice melodious and perfectly modulated. But as her attendants busied themselves selecting goblets, she stepped closer to Lyra and lowered her voice to a whisper that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate vicinity. "I know what you are, servant girl." The words hit like a physical blow, stealing Lyra's breath and making the wine tray tremble in her hands. "My lady." "You think I don't see the way the war beasts watch you, the way they shift and stir whenever you're near?" Seraphina's smile was beautiful and terrible, like sunlight on a blade. "I've been studying magical theory since I could read. I know the signs of suppressed bloodline power when I see them." Lyra's mouth went dry as dust. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't. That's the beauty of a properly constructed binding spell. The victim never knows what they've lost." Seraphina reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from Lyra's face, with fingers that felt like ice against her skin. But binding spells can be broken. Little foundling, and when they are, the results are often explosive. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that only came from absolute confidence in one's own power. Lyra wanted to step back, wanted to run, wanted to do anything except stand there trembling under that terrible gaze. "I should return to my duties," she managed to say. "Yes, you should." Seraphina's smile widened. "After all, someone needs to clean up the mess after today's trials are complete. It would be such a shame if that mess included more than just beast droppings and spilled wine." As Lyra retreated from the pavilion on shaking legs, she could feel Seraphina's gaze following her like a weight pressing against her spine. The beautiful noblewoman knew something, had recognised something in her that even Magnus's constant cruelty had failed to detect. And from the tone of that whispered threat, whatever Seraphina planned to do about her knowledge would not end well for a powerless servant girl. But she wasn't powerless, was she? The Shadowmane's words echoed in her memory, reminding her that the weakness she had always believed defined her was nothing more than an elaborate lie designed to keep her safe. Somewhere beneath the carefully constructed facade of worthlessness, she carried the blood of ancient kings and the power to command creatures of legend. The question was whether she could access that power before Seraphina decided to eliminate the threat she represented. A horn sounded from the arena floor, its deep note resonating through the stone amphitheatre and commanding silence from the gathered crowd. The trials were about to begin, and Lyra found herself moving closer to the barrier that separated the seating area from the central space where destiny would unfold. The contestants filed into the arena in order of precedence, their ceremonial armour glinting in the morning sunlight. Lord Aldrich's son carried himself with the confident swagger of someone who had never doubted his own worthiness. Lady Morgana moved with predatory grace, her eyes already fixed on the enclosures that housed the frost wolves she intended to claim. And then Alpha King Kyle entered the space, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Even from a distance, his presence was overwhelming. He moved with the kind of controlled power that spoke of strength held carefully in check, of violence leashed but never truly tamed. His dark hair caught the light like polished obsidian, and his eyes held the golden flecks that marked him as born to rule. He wore no ceremonial armor, no ritual markings, nothing but simple leather clothing that emphasized, rather than concealed, the raw physical power that radiated from his frame. But it was more than his physical presence that commanded attention. There was something in the way he carried himself, in the careful awareness with which he surveyed the arena and the war beasts waiting within their enclosures, that spoke of a mind capable of seeing connections others missed. He was hunting, she realized, not just looking for a war beast to bond with, but searching for something specific, something he would recognize when he found it, even if he couldn't name what it was. As his gaze swept across the seating areas, acknowledging the noble families who had come to witness his choice, Lyra found herself frozen in place. She should have looked away, should have returned to her duties among the refreshment stations, should have made herself invisible the way she always did when people of importance were present. Instead, she stood transfixed as those golden-flecked eyes found hers across the impossible distance of the arena. The connection was instantaneous and overwhelming, like lightning jumping between storm clouds, like recognition that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to something deeper and more fundamental than logic. She felt it in her chest, in her bones, in the very core of her being, a pull so strong it threatened to drag her over the barrier and onto the arena floor before she could think to resist. And from the way Kyle's entire body went rigid, from the way his eyes widened in shock and something that looked dangerously like hunger, she knew he felt it too. The mate bond, the connection the Shadowmane had spoken of, the invisible thread that bound two souls together across whatever distances or obstacles might try to keep them apart. It was real, and it was here, and it was pulling at both of them with a force that made mockery of political arrangements and social hierarchies. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they simply stared at each other across the arena. A king and a servant girl, a ruler and a foundling, two people whose lives should never have intersected in any meaningful way. But the bond between them sang with truth, and in his eyes she saw the same recognition that had been building in her own heart since the moment she first laid eyes on him. Then someone called his name from the arena floor, breaking the spell that had held them both captive. Kyle jerked his attention away from her, his face schooling into a mask of royal composure even as she could see the tension thrumming through his powerful frame. He had duties to attend to, trials to complete, a destiny to fulfill that had nothing to do with invisible servant girls and impossible connections. But as he turned toward the war beast enclosures and the trials that would determine his future, Lyra felt the bond between them stretch like a golden thread that refused to break. Whatever happened in the arena today, whatever choices were made and destinies claimed, this connection would not simply disappear because it was inconvenient or politically impossible. She was still his mate. He was still hers. And somewhere in the depths of her being, the power that had been sleeping for 19 years stirred to wakefulness, called forth by the recognition of the one soul in all the world that was meant to stand beside hers. The bonding trials had begun, but the most important bonding of all was happening in the space between heartbeats, in the silence between words, in the golden thread that connected a lost princess to the king she was destined to love. Chapter 4. Unexpected Reactions. The first contestant stepped into the arena with all the confidence of someone who had never faced true rejection. Lord Aldrich's son, Garrett, strode toward the ironback wyvern's enclosure with his ceremonial sword gleaming at his side and his family's ancestral war paint streaking his cheeks in patterns of blue and gold. The massive dragon-like creature watched his approach with eyes like molten copper, its scaled hide rippling with barely contained power. Lyra forced herself to look away from Alpha King Kyle and focus on her duties, but the golden thread connecting them pulled at her consciousness like a tide she couldn't resist. Even as she moved through the crowd with her tray of refreshments, she could feel his presence like heat against her back, could sense the careful way he was avoiding looking in her direction, while his own war-beast companion grew increasingly restless at his side. Fenris, the Alpha King's bonded wolf, was a magnificent creature with silver-touched fur and intelligence that burned like starlight in his pale blue eyes. He had been Kale's companion since childhood, chosen during the King's own bonding trials 15 years ago, and their partnership was the stuff of legend. But today, something was wrong. The great wolf paced at the edge of the arena with his ears laid back and his tail lashing, his attention constantly drifting away from his bonded partner to search the crowd for something he couldn't identify. "Easy, Fenris," she heard Kale murmur from across the arena, his voice carrying that particular tone of command that could calm even the wildest beasts. But the wolf's agitation only increased, and Lyra realized with growing alarm that Fenris was tracking her movement through the crowd with the same intensity the other war beasts had shown in the stables. In the center of the arena, Garrett reached the ironback wyvern's enclosure and began the formal ritual of introduction. He spoke the ancient words that had been passed down through generations of warriors, his voice strong and clear as he offered his strength, his loyalty, his very life in service to a creature whose power could reshape battlefields. The wyvern listened with the patience of something that had heard such offerings countless times before, its massive head tilted in consideration. But even as the formal bonding attempt began, Lyra became aware of a disturbance rippling through the war beast enclosures that ringed the arena. It started subtly, just a shift in posture here and there, but quickly escalated into something that made the crowd begin to murmur with unease. The Shadow Lynx twins had positioned themselves at the very front of their enclosure, their smoke-coloured fur standing on end as they tracked her movement with laser intensity. Their bonded warriors seated in the noble section were calling out in confusion as their usually obedient companions ignored every command and gesture of Rhea Sal. A young griffin left its elevated perch to pace the length of its domain, golden eyes fixed on her with an hunger that made her breath catch in her throat. The creature's talons scraped against stone with each step, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the rapid beating of her own heart. Even the ancient stoneback tortoise, normally as motionless as its name suggested, had extended its massive head from its shell and was watching her with eyes that held too much knowledge for comfort. The crowd was beginning to notice the unusual behaviour, their conversations shifting from excitement about the trials to confusion about what could be causing such widespread agitation among creatures that were supposed to be perfectly controlled. "What's wrong with them?" she heard someone whisper from the noble seating. "They're acting like they've caught scent of something that shouldn't be here." Magnus appeared at her elbow with his usual impeccable timing for making her life more difficult. "You," he hissed, grabbing her arm with fingers that bit through the thin fabric of her servant's uniform. "What did you do?" "Nothing," she said, but even as the word left her lips, she could feel power stirring in her chest like a creature waking from long sleep. The binding spell that had kept her true nature hidden for 19 years was beginning to crack under the pressure of recognition, and the magical resonance was affecting every supernatural creature within the arena's boundaries. "Don't lie to me, girl. I've been working with war beasts for 30 years, and I've never seen them react like this to a servant." His grip tightened until she was sure it would leave bruises. "Tell me what you did, or I'll have you thrown out of the kingdom before the sun sets." But before she could respond, a sound erupted from the ironback wyvern's enclosure that made everyone in the arena freeze. Not the roar of acceptance that would signal a successful bonding, but a shriek of rejection so violent and absolute that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient stone amphitheatre. Garrett stumbled backward as the massive creature reared up on its hind legs, wings spread wide in a display of dominance that cast shadows across half the arena floor. The wyvern's copper eyes blazed with fury as it rejected not just the young lord's offer of partnership, but his very presence in its domain. The formal words of bonding that he had spoken with such confidence moments before were answered with another bone-rattling shriek and a blast of superheated air that sent him scrambling for the safety of the arena's edge. The crowd erupted into shocked murmurs as the first contestant retreated in defeat, but Lyra barely heard them. The wyvern's rejection had triggered something in the other war beasts, a cascade of supernatural awareness that was building toward a crescendo she could feel in her bones. The griffin's pacing became more agitated, its golden eyes never leaving her face even as its bonded warrior tried desperately to regain its attention. The Shadow Lynx twins began making sounds she had never heard before, soft trilling calls that seemed to be directed specifically at her. Even the creatures that were still bonded to their chosen warriors were showing signs of distraction, their loyalty wavering as they sensed something that called to instincts older and deeper than any human partnership. And through it all, she could feel Cale's attention, like a weight against her consciousness. He was no longer trying to avoid looking at her. Instead, his golden-flecked eyes tracked her movement through the crowd with the same intensity as the war beasts, and she could see the growing tension in his powerful frame as he fought to understand what was happening. Fenris let out a low whine that carried across the entire arena, and this time Cale couldn't calm him with words or gestures. The great wolf's attention was fixed on Lyra with laser focus, his pale blue eyes bright with recognition that transcended the bond he shared with his royal partner. He took a step toward the crowd, then another, and Lyra realized with growing panic that the legendary creature was preparing to abandon his position at the Alpha King's side to investigate the source of whatever was calling to him. "Fenris, heel!" Kyle commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority and years of partnership. But the wolf hesitated for the first time in their long association, his massive head turning between his bonded partner and the servant girl who was somehow disrupting the natural order of the entire arena. That moment of hesitation was like a crack in a dam, and through it flooded awareness that could no longer be contained or denied. Every war beast in the arena turned toward Lyra with the synchronicity of a flock of birds changing direction, their various calls and cries creating a symphony of recognition that made the crowd fall into stunned silence. She felt the power in her chest respond to their acknowledgement like a flame touched with oil, burning brighter and hotter until she was afraid it might consume her from the inside out. The binding spell that had kept her true nature hidden was unravelling thread by thread, and with each broken strand, more of her authentic self bled through into the world. "Impossible," Magnus whispered, but his grip on her arm had gone slack as he stared at the unprecedented sight of dozens of war beasts focusing their attention on a single servant girl. This can't be happening, but it was happening, and there was no stopping it now. Lady Morgana had entered the arena to attempt bonding with the frost wolves, but the pack creatures were ignoring her completely, their ice-blue eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that made the noble woman's carefully prepared ritual seem like meaningless theatre. In the noble seating, she could see Seraphina rising to her feet, her beautiful face twisted with fury as she realized that whatever she had planned to do about the servant girl's suppressed bloodline, the situation was rapidly spiralling beyond anyone's control. And in the centre of it all, Alpha King Kyle stood frozen between his duties as a ruler and the pull of recognition that was threatening to tear him apart. She could see the war happening behind his eyes, the careful political calculations warring with something far more primal and undeniable. The mate bond between them sang with increasing intensity, and she realized that her awakening power was calling to his as well. He was fighting to maintain his composure, to complete the trials as tradition demanded, but every passing moment made it harder for either of them to ignore the truth that was blazing like wildfire through both their souls. She was not nobody. She was not invisible. She was the lost princess whose very existence was reshaping the supernatural landscape of the kingdom, and every creature of power in the arena could sense it. The question was whether she could survive long enough to understand what that meant, or whether the forces she was unleashing would destroy her before she learned to control them. But as she met Kyle's eyes across the chaos of the arena and saw her own desperate recognition reflected in his gaze, she knew there was no going back to the safety of invisibility. The trials would continue, but they would no longer follow any script that anyone had planned. The war beasts had recognized their true queen, and now the entire kingdom would have to decide what to do about it. Chapter 5. The Shadow Mane. Breaks free. The sound started low, almost below the threshold of human hearing, but it resonated through the ancient stone of the arena like the rumble of a distant earthquake. Every conversation in the amphitheatre died as 10,000 people felt that vibration in their bones, felt the promise of violence that came with it, like the scent of lightning before a storm. In the far section of the war beast enclosures, where the most dangerous creatures were kept behind layers of magical barriers and reinforced stone, something was stirring. Something that had been contained for 2 centuries was testing the limits of its prison, and the very foundations of the arena groaned under the pressure of that ancient fury. Lyra felt the Shadowmane's awakening like a second heartbeat in her chest, its rhythm synchronizing with her own until she couldn't tell where her pulse ended and the great beasts began. The power that had been building inside her all morning suddenly surged higher, responding to the call of the creature that had first recognized her true nature, and she staggered under the weight of forces she couldn't begin to understand. "Something's wrong," someone shouted from the noble seating, their voice high with panic. "The containment barriers are fluctuating." The magical shields that surrounded the Shadowmane's enclosure were indeed wavering, their usual steady glow flickering like candle flames in a hurricane. The creature within was no longer merely restless. It was actively testing the bonds that had held it for longer than most people had been alive, and those bonds were beginning to show signs of strain under pressure they had never been designed to withstand. Magnus released his grip on Lyra's arm, as if her skin had suddenly become white-hot, his face going pale as he stared toward the source of that ominous rumbling. "This is impossible," he whispered. "The Shadowmane hasn't shown this level of agitation since the day it was captured. What could possibly—" His words were cut off by a sound that made every person in the arena freeze in place. Not the rumble of contained fury they had been hearing, but something far more dangerous. The sharp crack of magical barriers beginning to fail under assault they couldn't withstand. The Shadowmane's roar, when it came, was like nothing Lyra had ever experienced. It wasn't just sound, but physical force, a wave of primal power that swept across the arena and left everyone within its reach gasping for breath. Windows shattered in the nearby palace towers. The carefully arranged refreshment tables overturned as crystal goblets exploded into glittering fragments. Even the other war beasts cowered before the display of dominance from their ancient superior. But more terrifying than the roar itself was what followed it. The sound of stone cracking under supernatural strength, of barriers designed to contain the unconquerable, finally meeting something that refused to be contained any longer. "Evacuation!" Kyle's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone born to command in crisis. "Clear the arena! All civilians to the upper exits, now!" The crowd exploded into motion, 10,000 people suddenly trying to flee through passages designed for orderly procession. Screams echoed off the stone walls as panic took hold, as mothers clutched their children and nobles abandoned their dignity in favour of speed. But even as they ran, Lyra found herself moving against the tide, drawn toward the source of the disturbance by a compulsion that overrode every survival instinct she possessed. The mate bond between her and Kyle sang with shared urgency, and she could feel his awareness of her through the chaos like a golden thread that refused to break. He was moving toward the shadow main section as well, but his path was blocked by fleeing spectators and the responsibility of ensuring their safety. His frustration blazed through the connection between them, matched only by his desperate need to reach her before she walked into a danger she couldn't possibly survive. The crack of failing barriers came again, louder this time, followed by the groan of ancient stone pushed beyond its limits. Lyra reached the edge of the arena floor just as the first section of the Shadow Main's containment finally gave way, releasing a burst of darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The creature that emerged from that breach was magnificent and terrible beyond anything legend had prepared her for. The Shadow Main stood easily 12 feet at the shoulder, its massive frame rippling with muscle beneath fur that seemed to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. Its eyes blazed like dying stars in the depths of that shadow-touched face, and when it moved, it did so with the fluid grace of something that had never doubted its own supremacy. But it wasn't rampaging. That was the detail that made her breath catch in her throat, that made her realize this wasn't just an escape born of frustrated captivity. The Shadow Main was searching, its great head turning back and forth as it tested the air with senses far keener than human perception could match. It was looking for her. The remaining spectators who hadn't yet reached the exits screamed in renewed terror as the legendary creature stepped fully into the arena, its massive paws leaving cracks in the ancient stone with each step. Warriors who had come to attempt bonding scrambled for their weapons or for the safety of the exit passages, their earlier confidence evaporating in the face of a threat their ancestors had needed an army to contain. "Stand down!" Kyle shouted, and Lyra saw him pushing through the chaos toward the arena floor, Fenris at his side and his own power beginning to manifest as golden light around his frame. "Everyone clear the space! Do not engage!" But the Shadow Main paid no attention to the fleeing humans or their shouted commands. Its star-bright gaze swept across the arena with the methodical patience of something that had waited 2 centuries for this moment and would not be deterred now that it had finally arrived. When those ancient eyes found her, the world narrowed to that single point of connection. Recognition blazed between them like lightning, but this time there were no barriers to contain it, no iron bars to limit its power. The Shadow Main approached her with reverent purpose, each step deliberate and measured, and Lyra found herself walking to meet it, despite every logical thought in her head screaming at her to run. The power in her chest roared to life in response to the creature's proximity, and she felt the last threads of the binding spell that had hidden her true nature finally snap under pressure they could no longer withstand. Magic flooded through her system like molten gold, awakening gifts that had been dormant for 19 years and transforming her from the inside out. "Lyra! No!" Kyle's voice carried across the arena, raw with desperation and fury. She could feel him fighting to reach her, could sense Fenris's confusion as his bonded partner's attention was torn between duty and the mate bond that was calling to him with increasing urgency. But she couldn't stop. The pull between her and the Shadow Main had transcended choice, become something as inevitable as gravity or the turning of the earth. She was meant to be here in this moment, facing the creature that held the key to everything she had never known about herself. The great beast stopped just outside the range of human weapons, its massive head lowering until they were eye to eye. This close, she could see intelligence in those star-bright depths that rivaled anything human, could feel the weight of centuries pressing against her consciousness as the ancient creature shared fragments of memory and knowledge. She saw herself as she truly was, reflected in eyes that remembered when her bloodline had ruled with wisdom and compassion. She saw the kingdom as it had been before plague and war had stolen the Starweaver line from the throne, before political marriages and territorial alliances had replaced the supernatural bonds that once united rulers with the land they protected. "I remember you," she whispered, and this time she understood exactly what the words meant. The Shadowmane's response resonated not through her ears, but through her bones, a vibration that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "And I have been waiting for you to remember yourself, Princess of the Star-Touch line, daughter of the blood that commanded loyalty through love rather than fear." Around them, the arena had fallen into an unnatural silence. The few spectators who remained were frozen in place, witnessing something that shouldn't have been possible according to every law of magical theory they understood. War beasts didn't choose servants. Ancient creatures didn't abandon centuries of hostility to kneel before foundlings with no bloodline to claim. But the Shadowmane was lowering itself to the ground before her, its massive frame folding into a posture of submission that hadn't been seen since the last Starweaver king had ruled from the throne. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning, witnessed by everyone who remained in the arena. Recognition, acceptance, and a loyalty that transcended political arrangements or social hierarchies. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched the creature's muzzle, feeling the same jolt of connection that had changed everything the first time they met. But now there were no barriers between them, no suppression spells limiting what she could access or understand. Power flowed between them like a river finding the sea, and she felt herself becoming something larger than the servant girl who had entered the arena that morning. Golden light erupted from the point of contact, visible to every eye in the amphitheatre, marking the completion of a bond that had been 2 centuries in the making. The illumination washed over both of them, transforming the servant girl and the legendary beast into something that belonged in the realm of myth rather than mortal politics. And in that light, everyone who witnessed it understood the truth that had been hidden for 19 years. The lost princess of the Starweaver line had returned to claim her birthright, and the kingdom would never be the same. Chapter 6. The Recognition. The golden light that erupted from the bond between Lyra and the Shadowmane was not merely illumination, but revelation itself made visible. It poured from the point where her hand touched the ancient creature's muzzle, like liquid starfire, washing over both of them in waves that seemed to rewrite reality with each pulse. The very air around them shimmered with power that had been sleeping for 2 centuries, awakening now to reclaim what had been lost to plague and politics and the careful lies of those who had hidden a princess in plain sight. In that light, Lyra felt the last vestiges of the binding spell that had concealed her true nature burn away like morning mist before the sun. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and endured cruelty dissolved into memory, replaced by someone whose presence commanded attention from every supernatural creature in the kingdom. Power flowed through her veins like molten gold, awakening gifts she had never known she possessed and transforming her from the inside out. The Shadowmane's submission was complete and absolute, its massive frame folded into a posture of reverence that hadn't been witnessed since the last Starweaver king had sat upon the throne. But this wasn't mere recognition of bloodline or ancient loyalty. This was acknowledgement of worthiness, of a soul that had proven itself worthy of the power it carried, despite 19 years of believing itself to be nothing. Impossible, someone whispered from the few spectators who remained in the arena, their voice carrying clearly in the unnatural silence that had fallen over the ancient amphitheatre. The Shadowmane chooses no one. It has refused every warrior for 200 years. But the evidence blazed before their eyes in golden light that made denial impossible. The legendary creature that had rejected kings and heroes was kneeling before a servant girl whose very existence rewrote everything they thought they understood about bloodlines and power and the natural order of their world. Alpha King Kyle stood at the edge of the arena floor, his powerful frame rigid with shock as he witnessed the impossible scene unfolding before him. Through the mate bond that connected them, Lyra could feel the war raging behind his golden-flecked eyes. the careful political calculations being shattered by recognition that transcended logic or convenience. Fenris pressed against his bonded partner's side, whining softly as he sensed the turmoil in his king's heart. The great wolf's pale blue eyes were fixed on Lyra with the same reverent attention she was receiving from the shadow mane, and she realized that Chaol's companion had recognized her true nature long before his human partner was ready to accept what that meant. "My lord," Fenris spoke directly into Chaol's mind, his mental voice carrying the weight of years of partnership and absolute loyalty. "The bond calls to you, the mate bond that has been pulling at your soul since the moment you laid eyes on her. She is not what she appears to be." Chaol's hands clenched into fists at his sides as he fought to maintain the composure expected of a king, while everything he had believed about his destiny crumbled around him. "She's a servant," he said, but his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "A foundling with no bloodline, no power, no claim to anything." "Is she?" Fenris pressed, his ancient wisdom cutting through royal denial with surgical precision. "Then why does the Shadowmane kneel? Why do all the war beasts recognize her authority? Why does the mate bond sing between you with such intensity that it threatens to tear you apart?" The golden light surrounding Lyra and the Shadowmane pulsed brighter, and in that brilliance, Chaol saw her as she truly was for the first time. Not the invisible servant who had cleaned his war beast's enclosures, but the lost princess whose bloodline had once united the supernatural and human worlds in harmony. The woman whose very existence made mockery of the political marriage that was supposed to secure his throne tomorrow, his destined mate, his true queen, the one soul in all the world that was meant to stand beside him, not because of political necessity, but because the universe itself had written their names together in starlight and prophecy. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making him stagger under the weight of truth he could no longer deny. The mate bond between them roared to life with such intensity that it was all he could do not to vault over the barrier, separating them, and claim her before the assembled witnesses. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to go to her, to place himself between her and any threat, to announce to the world that she was his and he was hers, regardless of what political consequences might follow. But even as his soul called to hers, even as the bond between them blazed with recognition that transcended royal duty, he was acutely aware of the eyes watching from the noble seating. Lady Seraphina stood frozen in her elegant pavilion, her beautiful face twisted with fury as she witnessed the destruction of everything she had planned and schemed to achieve. The other noble families muttered among themselves with voices that carried shock, confusion, and the kind of political calculation that would reshape alliances before the day was out. In the arena, the golden light was beginning to fade, but its effects remained written across reality in ways that could never be undone. Lyra rose to her feet beside the still kneeling Shadowmane, and the transformation that had taken place within that illumination was visible to every eye present. She carried herself with unconscious grace that spoke of royal blood finally acknowledged, and power radiated from her frame like heat from forge fire. Her dark hair seemed to hold starlight within its depths, and her eyes blazed with the kind of inner strength that marked those born to rule, not through fear, but through love willingly given. The servant's uniform she wore looked ridiculous now, a costume that no longer fit the truth of who she had become. "I am Lyra of the Starweaver line," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the arena, despite the fact that she spoke barely above a whisper. The words resonated with power that made the ancient stones respond, made every supernatural creature present acknowledge her claim with postures of respect. "Daughter of King Alderon and Queen Celestine, hidden among you for 19 years while my power slept and my enemies believed the royal bloodline extinct." The declaration sent shockwaves through the remaining crowd. Some gasped in disbelief, Others fell to their knees in automatic deference to royal blood they hadn't known still existed, but all of them understood that they were witnessing history, that the lost princess whose return had been prophesied for 2 centuries was finally reclaiming her birthright. Kyle felt the mate bond surge stronger as she spoke her true name, felt the recognition blazing between them like a fire that would consume them both if they continued to deny its call. She was looking at him now, her starlight-touched eyes meeting his across the arena floor, and in that gaze he saw everything he had been searching for without knowing what he sought. Love, partnership, a queen who would stand beside him, not because politics demanded it, but because their souls had been forged as matching pieces of the same eternal whole. The completion he had ached for since childhood, the sense of rightness that had eluded him through years of duty and sacrifice and careful political manoeuvring, but he also saw the impossibility of it all. Tomorrow he was meant to mate with Seraphina in a ceremony that would unite the northern and eastern territories, securing peace through bloodline alliance that had been negotiated since before either of them was born. Breaking that arrangement would mean war, would mean chaos, would mean abandoning responsibilities that affected every person in the kingdom. "This changes nothing." Seraphina's voice cut through the charged atmosphere like a blade, her words pitched to carry to every corner of the arena. Royal blood or not, she remains a foundling with no legitimate claim to the throne. The mating ceremony proceeds as planned. But even as she spoke, the noble families were already beginning to reassess their positions. Whispered conversations rippled through the seating areas as political alliances shifted to accommodate the new reality. Some would support Seraphina's claim that bloodline alone wasn't enough to overturn existing agreements. Others would recognise that a king mated to the true Starweaver heir would possess a legitimacy that no political arrangement could match. The Shadowmane rose to its feet beside Lyra, its massive presence a reminder that she now commanded the loyalty of the most powerful war beast in the kingdom's history. Other creatures throughout the arena were showing similar signs of recognition, their own bonds to human partners wavering as they sensed the return of the bloodline that had once united their kinds in harmony. And through it all, the mate bond between Lyra and Kyle continued to strengthen, continued to call to both of them with increasing urgency. They were meant to be together. The universe had written that truth in starlight and prophecy, had bound their souls across lifetimes and circumstances, but wanting something and being able to claim it were very different things, especially when kingdoms hung in the balance. Lyra took a step toward him, her hands still resting on the Shadowmane's great head, and Kale felt his careful control beginning to crack under the pressure of recognition that threatened to sweep away everything except the need to go to her. One step became 2, then 3, and he realized she was walking toward him with the same inevitability that had drawn her to the Shadowmane. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the lost princess approached their king, as 2 souls that had been searching for each other finally prepared to meet in the light of truth that could no longer be denied. But before she could reach him, before he could close the distance between them and claim his true mate regardless of political consequences, a sound echoed across the arena that made everyone freeze in place. The horn of challenge blown by those who disputed the right of recognition. The formal call that could stop even a royal claiming if the challenge carried enough political weight to demand answer. Seraphina stood in her pavilion with the horn still pressed to her lips, her beautiful face set in lines of determination that promised this battle was far from over. The lost princess might have returned, but she would have to fight for every scrap of the birthright she claimed to possess. Chapter 7. Aftermath and Accusations. The horn of challenge echoed across the arena like the tolling of a funeral bell, its ancient notes carrying power that could bind even royal blood to ancient laws. The sound froze Lyra mid-step, the mate bond between her and Cale suddenly constrained by protocols that had governed disputes of succession for 1,000 years. She could feel his frustration blazing through their connection, could sense his desperate need to reach her being held in check by the duties that defined his reign. Serafina lowered the challenge horn with the satisfied smile of someone who had just played a card she had been saving for precisely this moment. Her golden hair caught the afternoon light like spun metal as she stepped forward to the edge of her pavilion, every inch the perfect noblewoman whose birthright had been challenged by an impostor with delusions of royal grandeur. "I invoke the right of disputation," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned arena. This foundling's claim to royal blood is unproven, her supposed bond with the Shadowmane, nothing more than dark magic designed to deceive the innocent. I demand that she be examined by the Elder Council before any recognition can be granted, and that she submit to magical testing to prove her bloodline is genuine rather than fabricated through sorcery. The words hit like stones thrown at glass, each accusation finding its mark with brutal precision. Around the arena, the remaining spectators began murmuring among themselves as political implications cascaded through noble families like ripples in a pond. Some nodded in agreement with Serafina's challenge, unwilling to accept that a servant girl could possess royal heritage no matter what supernatural creatures might claim. Others whispered of prophecies and ancient bloodlines, remembering stories their grandparents had told of the lost Star Weaver princess who would one day return to reclaim her throne. Lyra felt the accusations settle into that familiar hollow space beneath her ribs where all such cruelties lived, threatening to wake the old doubts that had defined her for 19 years. But the Shadowmane pressed closer to her side, its massive presence a reminder that she was no longer the powerless servant who had learned to make herself invisible. Power thrummed through her veins like liquid starfire, and with it came certainty that transcended any political manoeuvring. "I submit to no one's testing," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made ancient stones respond and war beasts acknowledge her supremacy. "My bloodline speaks for itself through bonds that cannot be counterfeited or conjured through dark arts. The Shadowmane has chosen, and its choice stands as proof that requires no council's validation." But even as she spoke the words with royal confidence, she could see the trap that Serafina had laid with masterful precision. The right of disputation was ancient law, older than the current kingdom, designed to prevent usurpers from claiming thrones through trickery or magical deception. Once invoked, it could not be dismissed by royal proclamation or supernatural recognition. It required formal response, formal proof, formal resolution through processes that could take days or weeks to complete. And in the meantime, the mating ceremony scheduled for tomorrow would proceed as planned. "The law is clear," Elder Thane said, his aged voice carrying from the council section where the kingdom's most learned advisers witnessed the unfolding drama. "A challenge of bloodline disputation must be answered through proper channels. Until the claimant can prove her heritage through documented lineage or magical verification that satisfies the full Elder Council, no recognition can be granted." Kyle's fury blazed through the mate bond with such intensity that Lyra staggered under its weight. She could feel him fighting against the constraints of law and duty that bound him more surely than any chains, could sense his desperate need to cross the arena and claim her regardless of political consequences. But he was trapped by the very responsibilities that defined his reign, caught between the mate bond calling to his soul and the obligations that affected every person in his kingdom. "This is madness," he said, his voice carrying the controlled rage of a ruler pushed beyond all patience. "The supernatural recognition is absolute. No magical deception could compel the Shadowmane to submit after 2 centuries of refusing every warrior who approached it." "Magic can be corrupted, my lord," Serafina replied with honeyed malice. "Binding spells can be crafted to mimic bloodline resonance, to create false connections that appear genuine to creatures who lack the wisdom to distinguish between truth and elaborate deception. Surely you would not stake your kingdom's future on the whims of a beast, no matter how legendary its reputation. The insult to the Shadowmane's intelligence and integrity rippled through the arena like a physical blow. The great creature's star-bright eyes blazed with fury as ancient pride was challenged by someone who had never earned the right to speak its name, let alone question its judgment. A low growl rumbled from its massive chest, a sound that promised violence to anyone foolish enough to continue such disrespect. But before the Shadowmane could act on its displeasure, before the situation could escalate beyond political manoeuvring into actual bloodshed, Magnus appeared at the edge of the arena with a contingent of palace guards behind him. His face was set in lines of grim satisfaction as he approached Lyra with the authority of someone carrying out orders from the highest levels of government. "By order of the Elder Council and the invocation of the right of disputation," he announced, his voice carrying across the arena with official weight, "the claimant will be escorted to secure quarters pending formal investigation of her bloodline claims. She will submit to magical testing and provide documentation of her heritage before any recognition can be granted." Lyra felt the trap closing around her with mechanical precision, felt the walls of law and protocol rising to separate her from the mate who blazed in her awareness like a second sun. But even as the guards approached with wary respect for the power that radiated from her frame, even as she realized she was about to be locked away while Seraphina consolidated her position, she refused to show fear. "I will go," she said, her voice carrying the dignity that came with royal blood finally acknowledged. "But know this, no cell can contain what I truly am, and no law can break bonds forged by the universe itself. The truth will be revealed, and when it is, those who have sought to deny it will answer for their choices." The Shadowmane rose to its full height beside her, its massive presence a reminder that she commanded loyalty that transcended human politics. "You will not face this alone, little princess." It spoke directly into her mind, its mental voice warm with affection and cold with promised retribution. "I have waited 2 centuries for your return. I can wait a little longer for justice to take its course." As the guards formed an escort around her, maintaining respectful distance from both her and the ancient creature that had chosen her, Lyra caught Kael's eyes across the arena one last time. The mate bond between them stretched like a golden thread as they were forced apart, carrying messages of love and determination and fury that transcended the need for words. "This isn't over," his gaze promised her, and she felt the truth of it resonate in her bones. Whatever political games Seraphina thought she was playing, whatever traps she had laid to secure her position as queen, she had underestimated the power of bonds that could not be broken by laws or protocols or the machinations of those who sought to deny them. But as Lyra was led away from the arena under guard, as the crowd began to disperse with voices raised in excited speculation about the day's unprecedented events, she could feel Seraphina's eyes on her like ice against her spine. The beautiful noblewoman had won this round through legal manoeuvring and political acumen, but the victory was temporary. The real battle was just beginning. The war beasts throughout the arena watched her departure with expressions of confusion and growing anger. Their recognition of her authority had not wavered despite the human politics that sought to deny it, and she could sense their restlessness building like pressure before a storm. They knew who she was, what she represented, and they would not accept her imprisonment indefinitely. Neither would her mate. Through the bond that connected them, she could feel Kael's rage building, could sense him planning and calculating and preparing to move heaven and earth to free her from the constraints that kept them apart. He was a king, with all the power and resources that title implied, and he would not allow political manoeuvring to separate him from the one soul in all the world that was meant to stand beside his. As the palace doors closed behind her and she was led through corridors of polished stone toward whatever secure quarters had been prepared for her detention, Lyra held on to that certainty. She was not the powerless servant who had entered the arena that morning. She was the lost princess of the Starweaver line, bonded to the most legendary creature in the kingdom's history, claimed by the mate bond to a king whose strength could reshape nations. The law might bind her for now, but laws were written by mortals, and she carried power in her veins that had been old when the first human settlements rose from wilderness. Truth had a way of revealing itself despite the efforts of those who sought to bury it, and when it did, the kingdom would remember why the Starweaver line had once been beloved rather than feared. But first she had to survive whatever tests and trials Seraphina had planned for her, and judging by the cold satisfaction in the noble woman's eyes as she was led away, those trials would test more than just her bloodline. They would test whether she had the strength to claim a crown that others would kill to keep from her grasp. Chapter 8. Bloodline Investigation. The secure quarters they had prepared for her were not quite a cell, but the distinction felt meaningless when the door sealed behind her with the whisper of magical locks engaging. Lyra found herself in a chamber that might have been luxurious under different circumstances. Polished stone walls adorned with tapestries, a comfortable bed draped in silk, even a small table set with refreshments that no doubt carried their own subtle enchantments for ensuring compliance. But the windows were barred with more than iron, and the very air hummed with containment spells designed to prevent anyone with supernatural abilities from simply walking through the walls. They had built her a cage worthy of royalty, and she was expected to wait within it while others decided whether she had the right to claim what was already hers by birth. She had been alone for perhaps an hour when the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor beyond her door. Not the heavy tread of guards, but something lighter, more deliberate. The magical locks disengaged with a soft chime, and Elder Thane entered her prison with the careful dignity of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics. He was older than she had realized when she had seen him in the arena, his silver hair and lined face speaking of years spent in service to the crown. But his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him the most respected scholar in the kingdom, and she could sense the subtle magical aura that marked him as someone whose power went far beyond mere academic knowledge. "Your Highness," he said, the title falling from his lips with a formality that carried surprising warmth. "I apologize for the circumstances of our meeting, but the law is clear regarding bloodline disputes. I am here to begin the formal investigation that will either prove or disprove your claim to the Starweaver heritage." Lyra studied him carefully, searching for signs of the political calculation she had expected to find in anyone connected to Seraphina's faction. Instead, she found only scholarly curiosity and what appeared to be genuine respect for the power that still radiated from her despite her imprisonment. "You believe me," she said, the words not quite a question. "I believe the Shadow Mane," he replied with a slight smile. "In 50 years of studying magical theory and supernatural bonds, I have never encountered a case where such a creature could be deceived by artificial bloodline resonance. The level of power required to fool something that ancient would leave traces detectable by any competent mage, and I sense no such deception in your aura." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by wariness. If Elder Thane already believed her claim was genuine, why had he supported Seraphina's right of disputation? Why allow her to be imprisoned while the investigation proceeded? As if reading her thoughts, he settled into the chair across from her small table with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested too many years of scholarly pursuits. "Because believing and proving are different things, Your Highness. The law requires documentation, genealogical evidence, magical verification that satisfies not just me, but the entire Elder Council. Lady Seraphina has allies among the Council who will not be swayed by supernatural recognition alone, no matter how unprecedented it might be." "What kind of proof do you need?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. She had no documents, no ancestral records, no artifacts that could trace her lineage back to the royal bloodline that had supposedly died out 2 centuries ago. Elder Thane reached into the leather satchel he carried and withdrew a collection of items that made her breath catch in her throat. Ancient texts bound in leather that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, a crystal sphere that pulsed with magical energy, and most striking of all, a portrait painted on ivory that showed a woman whose face could have been Lyra's own, down to the starlight that seemed to dance in her dark eyes. "Queen Celestine," he said, noting her shocked recognition. "Your mother, if your claim proves true. The resemblance is remarkable." He set the portrait carefully on the table between them, handling it with the reverence due to the last known image of the Star Weaver line. But resemblance alone is not proof. We will need to delve deeper to trace the magical signatures that run in royal blood and compare them to what flows in your veins. The process he described sounded invasive and potentially dangerous, but Lyra nodded her agreement. She had nothing to hide, nothing to fear from magical examination that would reveal the truth of what she carried within her. What followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Elder Thane placed his hands on either side of her head, his weathered fingers warm against her temples, as he began the deep magical probe that would map her bloodline back through generations. She felt his power sink into her consciousness like gentle fingers exploring the depths of a clear pool, touching memories and magical signatures that had been woven into her very essence since birth. The examination revealed truths that staggered both of them. Not just the Starweaver heritage that blazed through her magical signature like golden fire, but the evidence of the binding spell that had concealed that heritage for 19 years. Layer upon layer of careful magical work, crafted by someone with skills that bordered on legendary. "Extraordinary," Elder Thane whispered, his eyes wide with scholarly amazement as he pulled back from the mental connection. "The binding spell that concealed your nature is masterwork beyond anything I have seen in 5 decades of study. Whoever cast this had access to power and knowledge that should have died with the old court mages." "Can you tell who cast it?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Not directly, but I can sense the magical signature well enough to recognize it if I encounter it again." His expression grew troubled as he made notes in a leather-bound journal. "What concerns me is the level of preparation this spell required. Someone knew the Starweaver line had survived, knew where to find you, and possessed both the power and the motivation to hide you so completely that even you forgot what you truly were." The implications were staggering. Her concealment hadn't been random chance or the desperate action of a dying bloodline. It had been planned, executed by someone with access to royal-level magical resources and the foresight to prepare for the day when she would need to reclaim her heritage. "There's something else," Elder Thane continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The magical resonance in your blood. It's not just Starweaver heritage. There are traces of older bloodlines, connections to the first families who bound themselves to the supernatural creatures that became the war beasts. You don't just carry royal blood, Your Highness. You carry the original bond magic that once united all the supernatural creatures under a single crown." The revelation hit her like lightning, illuminating corners of her consciousness that had remained dark since her awakening. She wasn't just the lost princess of a defunct royal line. She was the heir to something far older and more powerful, a bloodline that predated the current kingdom by centuries. "That's why the Shadow Mane chose you," Elder Thane said, his scholarly excitement evident despite the gravity of their situation. "That's why all the war beasts recognize your authority. You don't just command their respect through royal heritage. You carry the original magic that created the bonds between their kinds and humanity." But even as the proof of her identity mounted beyond any possible dispute, even as Elder Thane compiled documentation that would satisfy the most sceptical council member, Lyra could feel danger building like pressure before a storm. Through the mate bond that connected her to Kyle, she sensed his growing desperation and fury. The investigation might prove her bloodline, but it couldn't accelerate the legal process that kept them separated. And tomorrow, the mating ceremony was still scheduled to proceed as planned. Lady Seraphina will not accept these findings easily, Elder Thane warned as he packed away his magical instruments. She has too much to lose if your claim is validated. A woman who would invoke ancient laws to prevent royal recognition will not hesitate to use more direct methods if legal manoeuvring fails to serve her purposes. The warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. As Elder Thane prepared to leave with his evidence of her royal heritage, as the magical locks prepared to engage once more, the sound of steel on stone echoed through the corridor beyond her door. Not the measured tread of guards changing shifts, but the purposeful advance of armed figures moving with deadly intent. Lyra felt her newly awakened power respond to the threat, felt strength flow through her muscles as instincts older than conscious thought prepared her for violence. "Get behind me," she told Elder Thane, but the elderly scholar was already moving, his own magical defences manifesting as golden light around his frame. The door to her chamber exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. Through the breach came figures dressed in black, their faces hidden behind masks that bore no identifying marks. But she didn't need to see their faces to know who had sent them, didn't need confirmation of what their presence meant. Seraphina had decided that if the law wouldn't eliminate the threat Lyra represented, then more permanent solutions would have to be employed. The investigation might prove royal bloodline, but dead princesses couldn't claim thrones or disrupt political marriages. The first assassin through the door carried a blade that gleamed with more than reflected light, its edge inscribed with runes designed to cut through magical defences as easily as flesh. But he had never faced someone whose power drew from sources older than human law, whose strength came not from careful training, but from the raw magical heritage of bloodlines that had once commanded the loyalty of creatures from legend. Lyra met his attack with hands that blazed with starfire, with strength that belonged to queens who had ruled when the world was young, and the bonds between supernatural and human were written in magic rather than politics. The assassin's blade shattered against her bare palms, its magical enchantments no match for power that predated the techniques used to forge them. But even as she dispatched the first attacker with ease that surprised them both, even as Elder Thane's own defences proved more formidable than his scholarly appearance had suggested, she realised this was only the beginning. Seraphina had committed to a path that could only end in victory or death, and she had the resources to ensure that if legal manoeuvring failed, more direct solutions would follow. The lost princess had been found, her bloodline proven beyond dispute, but proving her heritage and surviving long enough to claim it were very different challenges, and the night was still young. Chapter 9. The Awakening. The second assassin moved with inhuman speed, his blade whistling through the air toward Lyra's throat with precision that spoke of extensive training and magical enhancement. But the power that had been sleeping in her veins for 19 years roared to life with a fury that transcended conscious thought, transforming her from defending princess into something far more primal and dangerous. Her transformation began with pain that lanced through every bone in her body as they cracked and reformed, as her spine elongated and her senses exploded into supernatural awareness that made the chamber around her seem blazingly bright despite the dim evening light. She heard herself scream, but the sound that emerged was something between human anguish and the howl of a creature whose power had been denied too long. The assassin's blade passed through empty air as her partially shifted form moved with speed that human eyes couldn't track. Her hand, now tipped with claws that gleamed like starlight, caught him by the throat and lifted him from the ground with strength that belonged to creatures of legend rather than mortal women. The runes carved into his weapon flared and died as they encountered power that predated the magical traditions they had been designed to counter. "You made a mistake coming here," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that belonged to the wolf spirit that was finally free to manifest after nearly 2 decades of forced dormancy. You made a mistake threatening someone under my protection. You made a mistake believing that walls and laws could contain what I truly am. Through the mate bond, she felt Kyle's awareness spike with desperate urgency as he sensed her danger and her transformation. The connection between them blazed with shared power as his own supernatural nature responded to hers, as the distance that separated them became irrelevant in the face of threats that demanded immediate response. Elder Thane had retreated to the far corner of the chamber, his scholarly robe singed from deflecting attacks, but his magical defences holding strong. His eyes were wide with amazement as he witnessed the emergence of power that belonged in the realm of legend rather than contemporary magical theory. Extraordinary, he breathed, even as more assassins poured through the shattered doorway. The transformation is unlike anything recorded in the histories. This isn't just royal bloodline awakening. This is primal magic responding to mortal threat. The third assassin carried weapons that hummed with killing enchantments, blades forged specifically to penetrate supernatural defences and end threats that conventional steel couldn't touch. But as he lunged toward her partially transformed figure, he discovered that some powers were too ancient to be countered by human artifice, too fundamental to be defeated by magical engineering. Lyra caught his blade bare-handed, her claws scraping against enchanted steel with sounds like lightning striking stone. The weapon's killing magic met the raw power that flowed through her bloodline and found itself lacking, its carefully crafted enchantments unravelling like silk threads exposed to flame. She twisted her wrist with casual strength and watched the blade snap like kindling. The assassin had perhaps a moment to register shock before her other hand found his chest and sent him flying across the chamber to impact the stone wall with force that left cracks in the ancient masonry. But even as she dispatched the immediate threats with ease that surprised her as much as them, even as her awakened power proved itself against opponents who had been trained and equipped to kill supernatural beings, she could feel something deeper stirring in the depths of her consciousness. The wolf spirit that had been bound and hidden for 19 years was not content with partial manifestation. It wanted full freedom, full recognition, full expression of everything she had been denied since childhood. The transformation that followed was unlike anything she had experienced in her dreams or visions. This was no gentle awakening of dormant gifts, but violent rebirth that rewrote her very essence from the cellular level upward. Her human form dissolved into light and shadow and raw power, then reformed into something that bridged the gap between mortal princess and supernatural force of nature. When the blazing illumination faded, when the echoes of her howl of liberation stopped reverberating through the stone chamber, she stood before the surviving attackers as something that belonged in the oldest stories of their people. Her wolf form was magnificent and terrible, silver-white fur that seemed to contain captured starlight, eyes that blazed with intelligence and power that transcended any human understanding of what was possible. But more than her physical transformation, more than the supernatural strength and speed that now flowed through her reformed body, was the sheer presence she commanded, the ancient magic that connected her bloodline to every supernatural creature in the kingdom, blazed like a beacon that could be felt across impossible distances, calling to allies and warning enemies that the lost princess had finally awakened to her full power. The remaining assassins took one look at what she had become and made the tactical decision that valor was less important than survival. They fled through the shattered doorway with speed born of terror, leaving behind weapons and wounded comrades in their desperate haste to escape the chamber that had become the birthplace of something beyond their ability to comprehend or defeat. Elder Thane lowered his magical defences with hands that shook from exhaustion and amazement. "Your Highness," he said, and his voice carried reverence that went beyond political courtesy to something approaching religious awe. "What you have just accomplished, there are no records of transformation magic at this level. The power you wield predates our understanding of what royal bloodlines can achieve." But Lyra barely heard him. Her enhanced senses were picking up sounds and scents that painted a picture of chaos spreading throughout the palace. The magical beacon of her awakening had been felt by every supernatural creature within miles, and they were responding with urgency that suggested something far more significant than a simple assassination attempt was unfolding. Through the mate bond, she felt Kale's presence blazing with answering power as his own supernatural nature resonated with hers. He was moving, she realized, fighting his way through whatever obstacles stood between them, with the desperation of a mate whose bond partner was under mortal threat. But he wasn't the only one responding to her call. From the direction of the warbeast enclosures came sounds that made the palace foundations tremble, roars and howls and cries of supernatural creatures whose loyalty had been awakened by recognition of their true queen. The Shadowmane's mental voice reached her across the distance like warm honey flowing through her consciousness. "We come, little princess, every creature that remembers the old bonds, every beast that carries loyalty in its blood, every supernatural being that recognizes the return of the bloodline that once united our kinds. Let those who would harm you face the fury of legends made manifest." The palace guards would be overwhelmed within minutes. The careful political balance that had kept the kingdom stable would shatter under the weight of supernatural forces, choosing sides based on bonds that transcended human law. And somewhere in the chaos, Seraphina would be making her own desperate moves to salvage a situation that had spiraled far beyond her control. Elder Thane gathered his scattered documents and magical instruments with the efficiency of someone who had survived decades of palace politics by knowing when to retreat and regroup. "The evidence of your bloodline is beyond dispute now," he said as he prepared to flee the chamber that had become ground zero for a supernatural revolution. "But proving your heritage and surviving the civil war it will trigger are very different challenges." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor beyond the shattered door. Not the chaotic retreat of failed assassins, but the measured advance of heavily armed forces moving with military precision. Seraphina had apparently prepared for the possibility that her first gambit might fail, and the sounds suggested she had resources that went far beyond hired killers. But Lyra was no longer the powerless servant who could be intimidated by shows of force or overwhelmed by superior numbers. She was the awakened princess, whose power connected her to every supernatural creature in the kingdom, whose very existence rewrote the rules that had governed their world for centuries. The wolf spirit that had finally achieved full manifestation after 19 years of captivity was eager to test its strength against whatever forces dared to threaten its human partner. And through the mate bond that blazed like a golden thread connecting her to the one soul in all the world that was meant to stand beside hers, she could feel Kyle's answering fury as he fought to reach her side. The lost princess had awakened to her full power, and the kingdom would never be the same. The only question now was whether it would survive the transformation that her emergence had triggered, or whether the old order would tear itself apart, trying to deny truths that could no longer be hidden in shadows and lies.